The year 2347 brought another quiet morning to the human colonies scattered across the Outer Rim territories. Captain Daniel Price stood on the bridge of the Horizon Guard and watched the stars drift past his viewport. His ship was old and the weapons were outdated, but nobody seemed to care much about that anymore. 3 generations had passed since humanity last fought a real war, and most people preferred it that way. The galaxy was peaceful, and Earth's government spent more credits on building new colonies than building warships. Daniel rubbed his tired eyes and checked the patrol schedule again. His crew consisted of 23 men and women who joined the Defense Force because it offered steady pay and a chance to see the stars. None of them were real soldiers. Most had never fired a weapon outside of basic training simulations. The Horizon Guard was technically a military vessel, but everyone knew it was just for show. They patrolled the border between human space and the Calthene sovereignty territory, and filed reports that nobody back on Earth ever read. Lieutenant Commander, Lisa Grant walked up beside him holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Daniel and stared out at the darkness beyond the ship. Lisa had been complaining for months about the lack of proper military readiness, but her reports went nowhere. The Unity Council back on Earth thought she was being paranoid. The Calthene had been their neighbors for 60 years, and there had never been any serious problems. Sure, there were occasional border violations and some trade disputes, but nothing that couldn't be solved with diplomacy and patience. Lisa took a sip of her coffee and made a face. The ship's recycling system made everything taste like metal. She turned to Daniel and asked him if he had heard about the latest incident near the Greenfield Station colony. 3 Calthene scout ships had crossed into human territory without permission last week. They claimed it was a navigation error, but Lisa didn't believe that for a second. The Calthene were testing them and seeing how far they could push before humanity pushed back. Daniel nodded slowly but didn't say much. He shared Lisa's concerns, but what could they do about it? The Horizon Guard couldn't take on 3 Calthene scouts even if they wanted to start a fight. His ship had light plasma cannons that were designed for clearing space debris and missiles that were probably past their expiration date. If the Calthene wanted to cause trouble, then Earth would need to send real warships, and Earth didn't have many of those anymore. Far below them on the colony world of New Haven, things were even more peaceful. Farmer Kevin Hayes woke up before dawn like he did every morning and walked out to check on his fields. The crops were growing well and the harvest would be good this year. Kevin had moved to New Haven 15 years ago with his wife and 2 children. They wanted a quiet life away from the crowded cities of Earth, and the Outer Rim colonies offered that in abundance. There were no wars out here and no crime and no pollution, just honest work and clean air and a community that looked after each other. Kevin's neighbor Amy Sullivan was already awake too. She taught at the local school where 46 children from the surrounding farms came to learn. Amy loved her job even though the school building was old and they never had enough supplies. She spent her own money buying books and educational programs because the colonial government was always short on funding. Nobody complained though. Life on New Haven was good, and everyone knew they were lucky to be there. The colonists had no idea that thousands of light years away in Calthene space their fate was being decided. High Commander Zrathkal sat in his war room studying holographic displays of human territories. He had been planning this operation for 2 years, and now everything was finally ready. The Calthene sovereignty needed more space for their growing population, and the human colonies were right, there for the taking. Zrathkal's intelligence officers had provided detailed reports about human military capabilities. The news was better than he had hoped. Humanity had fewer than 200 combat vessels spread across dozens of star systems. Most of their ships were old and poorly maintained. The defense forces were understaffed and undertrained. The colonies themselves had almost no protection at all. Some worlds didn't even have orbital defense platforms, and the ones that did were equipped with civilian-grade weapons. The Calthene military, by comparison, was strong and experienced. They had fought 3 wars in the last century and won all of them. Their ships were modern, and their soldiers were professional warriors who trained constantly for combat. Zrathkal commanded a fleet of 800 vessels, and he was certain that he wouldn't need even half of that number to conquer human space. He presented his plan to the Sovereignty's War Council, and they approved it without much debate. The High Elders saw the same opportunity that Zrathkal saw. Humanity was weak and distracted and ripe for conquest. A quick war would give the Calthene valuable territory and resources, and it would send a message to other species. In the galaxy that the sovereignty was not to be challenged, the Rathcal selected 3 human colonies for the first strike: New Haven and Greenfield Station and Port Jackson. All 3 were farming worlds with large civilian populations and minimal defenses. The plan was simple and brutal. His fleets would emerge from hyperspace without warning and destroy the orbital platforms before the humans could even send a distress signal. Ground forces would deploy immediately and secure the major population centers. Any resistance would be met with overwhelming force. The High Commander expected the whole operation to take less than a week. After that, Earth's government would have a choice to make. They could surrender the Outer Rim territories and accept Calthene rule, or they could watch more colonies burn. Zarathkal was confident they would choose surrender. Humans had grown soft during their long peace, and they wouldn't sacrifice millions of lives for some distant farming worlds. Back on the Horizon Guard, Captain Daniel Price finished his coffee and prepared to write another routine patrol report. He had no idea that in less than 48 hours everything would change. The peaceful galaxy that humanity had enjoyed for 3 generations was about to end. The Calthene were coming, and they expected an easy victory. They had studied human history, but they had only looked at the last 100 years of peace. They had not bothered to look deeper. They did not know what humanity was capable of when threatened. They did not know about the beast that slept beneath the surface of every human colony and every human heart. That beast had been sleeping for a long time, but soon it would wake up, and when it did, the galaxy would remember why humanity had once been feared. The attack came without warning on a Tuesday morning when most of the colonists were just starting their day. Kevin Hayes was feeding his livestock when the sky above New Haven suddenly filled with dark shapes. He looked up and dropped the bucket of grain he was carrying. Massive warships were emerging from nowhere, and they were dropping toward the planet like falling mountains. Kevin had never seen a Calthene vessel before, but he knew immediately that these were not human ships. The orbital defense platform above New Haven detected the incoming fleet 3 seconds before it was destroyed. The automated systems managed to send out 1 distress signal before Calthene missiles tore the platform apart. Debris rained down through the atmosphere and burned like falling stars. On the ground, the colonists watched in horror as their only protection vanished in a ball of fire. Captain Daniel Price was 8 light-years away when he received the distress call. The message was brief and broken up by static, but the words were clear enough. New Haven was under attack. He immediately ordered the Horizon Guard to jump to hyperspace, but he knew they would be too late. Lisa Grant stood beside him and ran calculations on her console. Even at maximum speed, it would take them 6 hours to reach New Haven. 6 hours was an eternity in a battle. 2 more distress signals came through in the next 10 minutes. Greenfield Station was under attack. Port Jackson was under attack. 3 colonies hit simultaneously. Lisa felt her blood run cold as she realized this was not a raid or a border skirmish. This was a full-scale invasion. She activated the emergency broadcast system and sent warnings to every human colony and outpost in the sector. Then she started trying to contact Earth, but the communication channels were jammed with panicked messages from a dozen different sources. On New Haven, the Calthene dropships were landing near every major settlement. Kevin ran back to his house and found Amy Sullivan already there. She had been driving to the school when she saw the ships descending. Her vehicle was abandoned on the road outside. Amy was trying to call the other teachers and warn them, but the communication network was down. Kevin grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the storm shelter beneath his barn. They weren't the only ones with that idea. 12 other colonists from neighboring farms came running toward Kevin's property. Everyone had seen the ships, and everyone knew they needed to hide. Kevin's storm shelter was the largest in the area, and it was stocked with food and water for emergencies. Nobody had ever imagined the emergency would be an alien invasion, but the shelter would have to do. Kevin got everyone inside and sealed the heavy door just as the first Calthene soldiers appeared over the ridge. Through the small periscope window, he could see them moving through his fields. They were tall and covered in dark armor that reflected no light. Their weapons looked cruel and efficient. Kevin counted 20 soldiers in the first group and then stopped counting. There were too many. The Calthene moved through the settlement methodically. They broke down doors and dragged colonists out of their homes. Anyone who resisted was shot immediately. The soldiers didn't speak or give warnings. They just followed their orders with cold precision. Within 2 hours, they had rounded up 300 civilians and locked them in the town meeting hall. Guards were posted outside with instructions to kill anyone who tried to escape. High Commander Zrathkal watched the invasion from his flagship in orbit. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. All 3 colonies had been taken with minimal Calthene casualties. The human defense platforms had been pathetically easy to destroy. The ground forces reported no organized resistance. Some colonists had tried to fight back with farming equipment and hunting rifles, but they were quickly overwhelmed. Zrathkal allowed himself a small feeling of satisfaction. This war would be over before it even began. He recorded a message to be transmitted to Earth. The message was simple and direct. The Calthene sovereignty now controlled 3 human colonies. More attacks would follow unless Earth surrendered all Outer Rim territories immediately. Humanity had 48 hours to accept Calthene rule or watch more of their people die. Zrathkal made sure his tone was dismissive and arrogant. He wanted the humans to understand how completely they had been defeated. On Earth, the message arrived during an emergency session of the Unity Council. President Charlotte Webb sat in the council chambers and watched Zrathkal's hologram with growing horror. Around her, the other council members were shouting and arguing. Some wanted to negotiate. Some wanted to send diplomatic envoys. Defense Secretary Marcus Flynn was the only one demanding immediate military action. He slammed his fist on the table and reminded everyone that 3 colonies were burning while they sat there talking. Charlotte raised her hand for silence. She was 62 years old and had spent her entire career building peace and promoting cooperation between species. She had never wanted to be a war president. But as she looked at the reports coming in from New Haven and Greenfield Station and Port Jackson, she realized she had no choice. Thousands of civilians were dead or captured. The Calthene had murdered families in their homes. They had targeted schools and hospitals. This was not a military operation. This was terrorism. She stood up and her voice was steady despite the fear she felt inside. Charlotte ordered Marcus Flynn to begin immediate mobilization of all available military forces. Every ship that could fly and every soldier who could fight was to report for duty within 24 hours. She authorized the Defense Secretary to take whatever resources he needed from the civilian sector. Ships and weapons and supplies, everything that could be spared and more. The council members stared at her in shock. Some tried to object, but Charlotte cut them off. She reminded them that they had sworn oaths to protect humanity. Right now, humanity needed protection and not debate. The time for diplomacy had ended the moment Calthene soldiers started killing colonists. Charlotte adjourned the meeting and walked out of the chambers. She had work to do. Captain Daniel Price finally arrived at New Haven 6 hours after the initial attack. What he found there made him sick to his stomach. The orbital space was filled with debris from the destroyed defense platform. Calthene warships patrolled in high orbit. On the surface, he could see fires burning in multiple settlements. The Horizon Guard was hopelessly outgunned, but Daniel refused to run away. He ordered Lisa to scan for survivors and start coordinating rescue efforts. They managed to locate several groups of colonists hiding in the wilderness. Daniel sent down shuttles under cover of darkness to evacuate who they could. It was dangerous work, and they lost 1 shuttle to Calthene fire. 18 people died in that crash, but they saved 43 others, including a group of children from Amy Sullivan's school. Lisa worked through the night coordinating with resistance groups on the ground and passing intelligence back to Earth. In his shelter, Kevin Hayes listened to the sounds of Calthene patrols walking overhead. Amy sat beside him in the darkness and held the hand of a frightened child. Around them, the other colonists whispered prayers and wondered if help would ever come. Kevin didn't know what would happen next, but he made himself a promise. If he survived this, then he would make the Calthene regret ever coming to New Haven. The farmer inside, him was dying and something harder was being born to replace it. The recruitment centers across Earth opened their doors at dawn, and by noon the lines stretched for blocks. Young men and women who had never considered military service stood waiting for hours to enlist. Parents brought their teenage children to sign up. Factory workers left their jobs and headed straight to the nearest recruiting station. The news from the colonies had spread across every network and every social platform. Everyone had seen the images of burning settlements and murdered families. Everyone wanted to do something. In the city of New Boston, a 73-year-old man named Peter Cross walked into the Central Military Headquarters building. The young lieutenant at the front desk looked at him with confusion. Peter was wearing an old dress uniform that barely fit anymore. The medals on his chest were from wars that most people had forgotten. The lieutenant started to explain that recruitment was happening at different locations, but Peter cut him off. He wasn't here to enlist. He was here to take command. President Charlotte Webb had called Peter 3 days ago and asked him to come out of retirement. He had spent the last 40 years living quietly on a farm in rural Montana. He raised horses and wrote memoirs that nobody read. He had been happy to leave the military behind. But when Charlotte told him about New Haven, he had packed a bag and caught the first transport to the capital. There was work to be done, and Peter Cross was one of the few people alive who remembered how to do it. Peter had commanded a battle group during the border wars of 2289. That conflict had been humanity's last real fight, and it had been brief but brutal. 3 human colonies had been caught in a territorial dispute with an aggressive species called the Vren. The war lasted 8 months and ended with complete human victory. Peter had been a young captain back then, but he had learned valuable lessons about what humanity could do when pushed to the edge. Those lessons were about to become relevant again. Defense Secretary Marcus Flynn met Peter in the war room beneath the Capitol building. The room was filled with holographic displays showing the current situation. 3 occupied colonies, 800 Calthene warships in human space, 214 human military vessels scattered across the sector. The numbers looked bad, but Marcus saw something in Peter's eyes that gave him hope. The old admiral was not scared. He was calculating. Peter spent 3 hours reviewing intelligence reports and fleet dispositions. Then he started making calls. His first call went to Commodore Helen Carter, who commanded the Tactical Planning Division on Mars. Helen was 46 years old and had spent her entire career studying military theory. She had written papers on naval warfare that were considered brilliant but purely academic. Nobody had needed her skills during peacetime. Now Peter told her to stop writing papers and start planning an actual war. Helen felt her pulse quicken as she accepted the assignment. The second call went to Captain Daniel Price. Peter promoted him to Rear Admiral on the spot and gave him command of all forces in the Outer Rim. Daniel protested that he wasn't qualified, but Peter didn't care about qualifications. Daniel had been at New Haven. He had seen what the Calthene were capable of. He had rescued civilians under fire. That made him more qualified than anyone sitting safely on Earth. Lisa, Grant became his chief tactical officer and second in command. Peter's third call went to the shipyards of Mars and Europa and the orbital construction facilities around Earth. He told them to start building warships and to forget about normal construction schedules. Money was no object. Safety regulations could be relaxed. Civilian ships could be retrofitted with military weapons. Every engineer and technician who could work was to report immediately. The shipyard managers tried to explain that building warships took years, but Peter told them they had months at best. Figure it out or watch the colonies burn. Something remarkable started happening across human space. The massive industrial capacity that had been dormant for generations suddenly roared to life. Factories that built farming equipment retooled to build missiles. Civilian shipyards began converting cargo haulers into troop transports. Mining operations diverted resources to military production. The economy shifted overnight from peace to war, and nobody complained about it. Everyone wanted to help. Everyone wanted revenge. On the occupied colonies, resistance movements were forming. Kevin Hayes emerged from his shelter after 5 days of hiding. The Calthene patrols had moved on to other areas, and he could move relatively freely. He found other colonists who had escaped capture, and they began organizing. Most of them were farmers and teachers and shopkeepers. None of them were soldiers. But they knew the land, and they were fighting for their homes. Amy Sullivan became the coordinator for an underground network. She used her teaching contacts to set up communication channels between resistance cells. Messages were passed through hidden channels and encoded in innocent-looking transmissions. The Calthene controlled the settlements, but the wilderness belonged to the humans. Supply convoys started disappearing. Patrol units went missing. The invaders realized too late that conquering territory and holding territory were two very different things. Kevin led a raid on a Calthene supply depot in the 3rd week of occupation. His team consisted of 11 farmers armed with hunting rifles and improvised explosives. They hit the depot at dawn and destroyed 3 months' worth of supplies. 2 of Kevin's people died in the attack, but they killed 14 Calthene soldiers. It was a small victory, but it proved that humans could fight back. News of the raid spread through the underground network and inspired other groups to take action. High Commander Zarathkal received troubling reports from his ground commanders. The occupation was not going as smoothly as planned. Human casualties were higher than expected, but the colonists refused to surrender. Small attacks were happening daily. His soldiers were getting nervous. The humans were supposed to be weak and frightened. Instead, they were angry and organized. Zarathkal ordered his commanders to increase patrols and respond to any resistance with overwhelming force. But the truly alarming reports came from his intelligence officers in orbit. They had detected massive fleet movements in human space. Dozens of warships were converging on staging areas near Earth and Mars. Construction yards were working around the clock. Troop transports were being loaded with soldiers. The humans were preparing for war, and the scale of their mobilization was far larger than anything Zarathkal's intelligence had predicted. He sent urgent messages back to the sovereignty capital requesting reinforcements. His 800 ships suddenly seemed inadequate. The War Council sent back confused replies. How could the humans be mobilizing so quickly? Their military was supposed to be small and weak. Zarathkal didn't have good answers. He only knew that something had changed. The sleeping giant that his intelligence officers had dismissed was waking up, and it looked very different from what they had expected. Admiral Peter Cross stood in the war room and watched the fleet assembly progress. 3 months had passed since the initial attack. In that time, humanity had built or retrofitted 147 warships. Veterans had returned to service by the thousands. New recruits had completed accelerated training programs. The logistics network was functioning. The supply lines were secure. Everything was ready. He called his senior officers together for the final briefing. Helen Carter presented the operational plan she had spent months developing. Daniel Price confirmed that his outer rim forces were in position. The Marine commanders reported that their troops were loaded and prepared for deployment. Peter looked at each of them and felt something he had not felt in 40 years. Pride and anticipation, and a cold certainty that they would win. The operation was called Tempest, and it would begin in 72 hours. Peter gave the order to move the fleet into position. Across human space, warships powered up their engines and began the journey toward the occupied colonies. On Earth and Mars and 100 other worlds, people gathered to watch the departure. They knew their military was going to war. They knew that some of those ships would not return. But they also knew that humanity would not accept occupation. The beast was awake now, and it was hungry for justice. Human fleet emerged from hyperspace above New Haven at exactly 0600 hours on a cold morning in March. 200 warships dropped into combat formation with precision. That would have been impossible 3 months earlier. The flagship Liberty's Fury led the assault group with Admiral Peter Cross commanding from the bridge. The massive battle carrier was flanked by cruisers and destroyers that spread out across orbital space like a steel net closing around prey. The Calthene occupation force had 68 ships in orbit. Around New Haven, they detected the human fleet 3 seconds after arrival and immediately scrambled to battle stations. Alarms blared across every Calthene vessel as crews rushed to their positions. The local commander sent urgent distress signals back to High Commander Zarathkal, requesting immediate reinforcements. He had expected that humans might eventually try to retake the colony, but not with such overwhelming force. And not this soon. Admiral Daniel Price commanded the forward assault group from his upgraded flagship, the Defiant. Storm. Lisa Grant sat at the tactical station beside him, coordinating targeting solutions with the other ships in their squadron. Daniel gave the order to engage, and the human fleet opened fire. Missiles streaked across the darkness, followed by lance beams of concentrated plasma. The Calthene ships tried to return fire, but they were caught out of position and still forming defensive patterns. The first Calthene destroyer exploded within 90 seconds of the battle starting. Its shields collapsed under sustained fire from 3 human cruisers, and then its hull ruptured in a brilliant flash. Debris scattered outward in an expanding cloud. 2 more Calthene ships died in the next 5 minutes. The human ships moved with practiced coordination that spoke of intense training and preparation. Every captain knew their role and executed it flawlessly. On the surface of New Haven, the colonists hiding in shelters and wilderness camps heard the thunder of orbital combat. Kevin Hayes stood on a hillside and watched the sky light up with explosions. Beside him, Amy Sullivan gripped his arm tight enough to hurt. They had waited 3 months for this moment. 3 months of hiding and fighting and wondering if Earth would abandon them. Now the cavalry had arrived, and it was glorious. The Calthene orbital defense began to collapse within the first hour. Their ships were individually powerful, but they were outnumbered nearly 3-1, and the human fleet fought with a ferocity that surprised them. Human captains pushed their vessels to the edge of structural failure. They took risks that seemed suicidal but somehow worked. When Calthene missiles broke through point defense systems, the human ships absorbed the damage and kept fighting. When shields failed, they relied on armor. When armor was breached, they vented atmosphere and sealed compartments and continued firing weapons. Commodore Helen Carter directed the ground assault from her command ship, the Resolute. She watched the tactical displays and waited for the orbital space to be secured. The moment the last Calthene warship retreated, she gave the order for marine deployment. 300 dropships launched from the troop carriers and began their descent through the atmosphere. Each ship carried 40 Marines who had spent every waking hour of the last 3 months training for this mission. The Marines hit the ground hard and fast. They deployed around every Calthene-controlled settlement simultaneously. The invaders found themselves surrounded and cut off from orbital support. Human soldiers moved through the streets with determination, born from months of watching news footage from the occupation. They had seen images of murdered colonists and burned homes. They had read reports of Calthene atrocities. Every Marine knew exactly why they were fighting. Kevin Hayes and his resistance fighters joined the assault as planned. They had spent weeks coordinating with the incoming fleet through coded transmissions. Now they guided the Marines through Calthene defensive positions and pointed out supply depots and command centers. The local knowledge proved invaluable. What should have been days of urban combat was compressed into hours because the resistance fighters knew every street and every building. The Calthene garrison commander realized within 2 hours that the battle was lost. He tried to organize a fighting retreat, but human forces had blocked every escape route. His soldiers were professional and well-trained, but they were facing an enemy that would not stop and would not retreat. Every time they established a defensive position, the humans found a way around it. Every time they tried to regroup, they were hit by resistance fighters who seemed to appear from nowhere. The liberation of New Haven took 3 days of brutal fighting. The Calthene soldiers fought hard because they knew surrender meant capture and likely execution. Human forces pushed forward relentlessly because every hour of delay meant more colonists remained in danger. The town of Riverside saw the worst fighting when Calthene troops barricaded themselves in the old community center, with 30 civilian hostages. Marine snipers took position on surrounding buildings and waited. When the Calthene commander executed 2 hostages to prove he was serious, a human sniper put a round through his head from 800 meters away. The siege ended 10 minutes later. When the last Calthene position fell, Kevin Hayes walked through the ruins of his settlement with tears streaming down his face. His farm was destroyed. His home was a burned-out shell, but his neighbors were alive and free. Amy Sullivan found him standing in what used to be his kitchen. She didn't say anything. She just stood beside him, and they watched Marines raise the human flag over the town. Square Admiral Peter Cross didn't waste time celebrating the victory at New Haven. While the ground forces were still securing the planet, he ordered the fleet to jump to Greenfield Station. The same pattern repeated itself. Human warships emerged from hyperspace in overwhelming numbers. Calthene orbital forces were caught unprepared. The battle was fierce but brief. Within 6 hours, the Calthene fleet at Greenfield was destroyed or scattered. Marine dropships descended and the liberation began. Greenfield Station fell faster than New Haven because the Calthene garrison had heard what happened at the first battle. Many of them surrendered rather than fight to the death. The human commanders accepted surrenders, but only after the colonists were freed and accounted for. Some Marines wanted revenge for the 3 months of occupation, but their officers kept them disciplined. This was a military operation, not a massacre. Port Jackson was liberated 4 days after Greenfield Station. By then, the Calthene forces knew they were facing defeat. Some units tried to flee, but human ships hunted them down. Others dug in and fought desperately. The third liberation was the bloodiest because desperation makes soldiers dangerous. But the outcome was never in doubt. Human forces had momentum and morale and overwhelming numbers. The Calthene had only fear. Admiral Daniel Price stood on the bridge of the Defiant Storm and watched Port Jackson's orbit clear of enemy vessels. Lisa Grant ran damage assessments and reported casualties. They had lost 18 ships and nearly 3,000 personnel across the 3 battles. The numbers hurt, but they could have been much worse. The Calthene had lost 247 ships and at least 15,000 soldiers. The ratio was heavily in humanity's favor. High Commander Zrathkal received the reports from his retreating forces and felt something he had not experienced in his long military career. Fear. The humans had not just defended their colonies. They had counterattacked with devastating effectiveness. His invasion force was shattered. 3 colonies were back in human hands. Worse still, the human fleet was not stopping. Intelligence reported that Admiral Cross was moving his forces deeper into Calthene space. They were not interested in negotiation or peace. They were interested in revenge. Zrathkal sent emergency requests to the sovereignty capital begging for reinforcements. The War Council finally began to understand the magnitude of their mistake. They had attacked a sleeping giant, and now that giant was fully awake and coming for them. Orders went out across Calthene space to mobilize every available warship. 12 full battle fleets were assembled and sent to stop the human advance. The sovereignty was committing everything they had because they finally understood what was at stake. This was no longer about territory or resources. This was about survival. The Calthene sovereignty assembled 12 battle fleets at the threshold system to stop the human advance. It was the largest military force they had ever gathered in one place. Over 900 warships formed defensive lines across the strategic crossroads that controlled access to both human and Calthene territories. High Commander Zrathkal commanded from his flagship and tried to project confidence to his officers. Surely this massive force would be enough to crush the human fleet and end this disastrous war. Admiral Peter Cross brought his fleet out of hyperspace at the edge of the threshold system and immediately assessed the situation. His 200 ships were facing a force nearly 5 times their size. Any reasonable commander would have retreated and waited for reinforcements. But Peter Cross had not come here to be reasonable. He had come here to end the war, and he would do it with the forces he had. He gave the order to advance, and the human fleet moved forward into weapons range. The battle began at maximum distance, with both sides launching missiles by the thousands. The space between the fleets filled with streaking contrails and point defense fire. Explosions blossomed like deadly flowers as missiles found targets or were destroyed in flight. Admiral Daniel Price led the Vanguard squadron directly toward the center of the Calthene formation. His orders were to break their line and create chaos in their ranks. It was a dangerous mission, but Daniel never hesitated. Lisa Grant coordinated the point defense systems as Calthene missiles closed on their position. She called out targets and firing solutions with mechanical precision even as the ship shook from near misses. 3 missiles got through the defensive screen and slammed into the Defiant Storm's shields. The ship lurched violently and several consoles exploded in showers of sparks. But the shields held and they kept moving forward. The 2 fleets collided like waves crashing together. Ships passed within kilometers of each other, exchanging fire at ranges where shields and armor meant everything. The noise inside each vessel was deafening. Weapons firing and engines straining and damage alarms screaming. Crew members worked their stations with sweat pouring down their faces. Some prayed. Some cursed. All of them did their jobs. Commodore Helen Carter was directing the battle from the Resolute when her ship took a direct hit from a Calthene heavy cruiser. The blast punched through the forward shields and tore open 3 decks. The bridge lost power and half her tactical displays went dark. Emergency lighting kicked in and Helen found herself standing in smoke and chaos. She grabbed a handheld communicator and kept issuing orders even as damage control teams rushed past her. The ship was dying, but she would not abandon her post. Her tactical officer managed to restore partial communications, and Helen ordered the evacuation of non-essential personnel. Then she transferred her command flag to the destroyer Vigilant and continued directing the fleet. 12 officers and 30 crew members died on the Resolute before the survivors could evacuate. Helen felt each loss like a knife wound, but there was no time to grieve. The battle was still raging and her fleet needed her. The Calthene had numbers, but the humans had something that proved more valuable. They had desperation and rage and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Human ships that should have retreated after taking damage stayed in the fight. Captains pushed their vessels beyond safe operational limits. Crews worked miracles keeping damaged systems running. When one ship fell, 2 others moved in to fill the gap. Admiral Price's squadron broke through the Calthene center line after 4 hours of continuous combat. His flagship was battered and bleeding atmosphere from a dozen hull breaches, but the weapons were still firing. He led his surviving ships in a sweeping turn that brought them behind the Calthene formation. Suddenly, the enemy found themselves caught between Price's squadron and the main human fleet. Their carefully planned defensive positions collapsed into confusion. High Commander Zrathkal watched his battle plan fall apart and felt cold terror grip his hearts. The humans were not fighting like any enemy he had ever faced. They took losses that would have broken any other fleet and kept attacking. Their tactics were aggressive to the point of insanity. Their captains made decisions with speed that suggested either genius or madness. Calthene doctrine emphasized careful planning and measured responses. Human doctrine seemed to be controlled chaos. The battle raged for 18 hours without pause. Ships on both sides were pushed beyond their limits. Crews fought through exhaustion and fear. The space around Threshold system became a graveyard of shattered vessels and floating debris. But slowly and inevitably, the tide turned in humanity's favor. The Calthene fleet began to fragment as individual commanders made the decision to retreat, rather than die for a losing cause. Zrathkal tried to rally his forces, but it was too late. The fleet was breaking, and once it started, nothing could stop it. He watched ships jump to hyperspace in ones and twos and then in whole squadrons. His own officers were looking at him with questions in their eyes. Questions about whether they should stay and die or run and live. Zrathkal had no answers anymore. He had underestimated humanity, and now his entire fleet was paying the price. Admiral Peter Cross pursued the retreating Calthene forces for 3 more days. His fleet was exhausted and damaged, but he would not let the enemy regroup. Human ships harried the survivors across 2 star systems. Every time the Calthene tried to form defensive positions, the humans attacked. It was relentless and brutal and effective. By the time Cross finally called off the pursuit, the Calthene fleet had been reduced to scattered remnants fleeing in panic. The cost of victory was high. Humanity lost 47 ships at Threshold, including the Resolute. Nearly 8,000 personnel died in the battle, but the Calthene lost over 600 vessels and at least 50,000 soldiers. Their military power was broken. Their confidence was shattered. The Sovereignty's War Council sued for peace within days of the battle ending. The surrender. Negotiations took place aboard the Liberty's Fury. Zrathkal came personally to face Admiral Cross. The Calthene commander looked old and defeated as he stood before the human admiral. Peter laid out the terms, and they were harsh. All occupied territories returned immediately. Full reparations paid to the families of killed colonists. Calthene military forces withdrawn to their core systems. Human monitoring stations established in Calthene space to enforce the treaty. The Sovereignty would sign, or the war would continue until nothing remained of their empire. Zrathkal signed without argument. He understood now what his intelligence officers had failed to see. Humanity was not weak. They had simply chosen peace. But when forced to fight, they became so terrifying. He had awakened beasts that should have been left sleeping. The galaxy would remember this lesson for generations. On New Haven, the reconstruction was already beginning. Kevin Hayes stood in the ruins of his farm and made plans to rebuild. Amy Sullivan was reorganizing the school with help from volunteers who arrived daily from Earth. The colony had been scarred by war, but it would heal. The people would heal. They had survived the worst, and now they could face anything. President Charlotte Webb addressed the galaxy from Earth. Her message was broadcast to every inhabited world and translated into hundreds of languages. She spoke about humanity's desire for peace and cooperation. She explained that humans had tried to be good neighbors and had paid in blood when that kindness was mistaken for weakness. The beasts were awake now and would remain vigilant. Any species could live beside humanity in peace, but any species that threatened human families would face the same fate as the Calthene. Admiral Peter Cross retired again after the treaty was signed. He had done what was necessary, but the cost haunted him. Thousands dead and colonies devastated and humanity's innocence lost forever. He returned to his farm in Montana and spent his remaining years raising horses and trying to forget the sound of ships dying in space. The galaxy called him a hero, but Peter just felt tired. The years that followed brought changes to human space. The colonies were rebuilt stronger than before. The military remained large and ready. Veterans of the Calthene War settled on frontier worlds and brought their experience with them. The peaceful farmers and teachers were still there, but now they were backed by people who remembered what war cost and were prepared to pay that price again if necessary. Other alien species watched humanity with new respect mixed with fear. The humans had proven they could be peaceful, but also that they could be deadly. Trade continued and diplomacy flourished, but nobody forgot the lesson of the Calthene. You could negotiate with humans. You could compete with them. You could even disagree with them. But you could not attack their families and expect mercy. The Calthene sovereignty survived but never recovered its former power. They became a cautionary tale told across the galaxy. The species that mistook human kindness for weakness and paid a terrible price. Their military was reduced to a fraction of its former size. Their territories shrank as subject species declared independence. They would spend generations rebuilding what they lost in 3 months of war. High Commander Zrathkal lived long enough to write a memoir about his failures. In it, he warned future generations about the dangers of underestimating an enemy based on incomplete intelligence. The humans had a saying that he included in his final chapter: "Let sleeping dogs lie." Zrathkal had not understood that saying when he planned his invasion. By the time he learned its meaning, it was far too late. He had kicked the dog and discovered it was actually a wolf. The galaxy would not make that mistake again.